Hey there, viewers. Before we dive into this story, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time is it on your end. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach. Now, buckle up, because the story you're about to hear might leave you shaken to your core. And Chapter 1: The Opportunity. Breaking into the music industry isn't a dream, it's an obsession. At least, that's how I felt back then. I was just another hungry songwriter trying to get noticed, hopping from open mics to small-time studios with nothing but a notebook full of lyrics and a fading sense of hope. The rejections were endless, not quite what we're looking for. Come back when you have more experience. You're talented, but it's a tough market. I'd heard it all. Still, every no just fueled my desperation to hear a yes. So when an invitation came, it felt like divine intervention. I was at a local showcase, playing a few songs for a half-empty room of uninterested faces. After my set, a man in a sleek suit approached me. He looked out of place, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to the dingy venue. "You've got something," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "We're scouting for talent. Someone high up has taken an interest in you." I thought it was a scam at first. Stuff like that doesn't happen to people like me. But when he handed me a business card with a recognizable logo, my doubts started to waver. He explained that I'd been invited to join an exclusive mentorship program run by one of the biggest names in the industry, Sean Combs. He didn't need to say the name twice. I knew exactly who he was talking about. "Don't waste this chance," he added before walking away. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities. I imagined myself sitting in studios with Diddy and other legends, my songs topping charts, my name finally respected in an industry that had ignored me for so long. For once, the future didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt tangible. The meeting was scheduled at a sprawling estate, the kind of place you only see in magazines or on TV. I remember the way my palms sweated as the gates swung open, revealing a driveway lined with manicured hedges and luxury cars that probably cost more than I'd make in a decade. The house itself was breathtaking, an architectural marvel of glass and stone that seemed to defy gravity. A staff member greeted me at the entrance. "This way," she said curtly, leading me down a long hallway. Her movements were brisk, almost robotic, and she didn't make small talk. Something about her demeanor felt off, now that I think about it, but I brushed it aside. I was too excited to care. When I finally entered the meeting room, he was already there, dressed casually but with an air of effortless authority. He exuded a confidence that filled the space. He rose to shake my hand, his smile wide and disarming. "Welcome," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "I've been hearing good things about you." I couldn't believe I was sitting across from him, the man whose name was synonymous with success, power, and influence. He spoke about his vision for the future of music, how he wanted to build an empire that celebrated creativity and gave young artists a platform to shine. It felt like a pep talk tailor-made for someone like me, someone who had been overlooked and underestimated for years. "You've got talent," he said, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "But talent isn't enough in this business. You need guidance. Someone who can show you how to navigate the game." His words struck a chord. I'd always felt like I was on the outside looking in, trying to figure out rules no one had bothered to explain. He made it sound like he was offering me the key to a secret world, one I'd only ever dreamed of being part of. The first task was simple: shadow his team, learn the ropes, and prove I was serious. I threw myself into it, determined not to waste the opportunity. The days were long, filled with meetings, studio sessions, and late-night brainstorming sessions. I learned more in a week than I had in years of trying to figure things out on my own. But there were moments, little things that didn't sit right. The way the staff seemed to freeze whenever he entered a room, their faces blank and unreadable. The way they avoided making eye contact with him, as if afraid they'd draw his attention. Everything they did felt rehearsed, as if they were following a script they couldn't deviate from. Then there were the rules. No phones in certain areas, no talking about what happened in meetings, no asking too many questions. "It's just how things are," one of his assistants told me when I hesitated. "You'll get used to it." At first, I chalked it up to professionalism. After all, this was a man who operated at the highest levels of the industry. Of course, his world would be different from mine. But as the days went on, the unease grew. The smiles didn't reach people's eyes. Conversations stopped abruptly whenever he approached. It was as if everyone was walking on eggshells, terrified of stepping out of line. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to learn, to grow, to make a name for myself. And for a while, that justification worked. I pushed aside my doubts, focused on the opportunities, and convinced myself that whatever discomfort I felt was a small price to pay for success. But deep down, a part of me knew better. There was something beneath the surface, something that didn't quite add up. And even as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far bigger and far darker than I could comprehend. As I left the estate that first day, I glanced back at the towering mansion. It loomed against the skyline, its pristine exterior hiding whatever secrets lay within. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning, one I wasn't ready to hear. Be careful what you wish for. Chapter 2. Trying to blend in. The first few days felt like stepping into a dream I never wanted to wake up from. Working alongside Diddy was everything I'd imagined and more. Luxury, influence, and the promise of being part of something extraordinary. Each morning I'd step into his sprawling estate, a world away from the small apartment I was used to. Marble floors, art pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum, and a constant buzz of activity surrounded me. It was intoxicating. Studio sessions became my new normal. The soundproofed walls vibrated with the bass-heavy tracks that would inevitably dominate the airwaves. Artists I'd idolized for years walked in and out of those doors like it was nothing. Even Diddy himself carried a presence that was hard to ignore. He moved through the room with authority, his voice booming over the music as he gave directions or cracked a joke that had everyone laughing, whether it was funny or not. The first time I met JayZ, I almost forgot how to breathe. He wasn't just an artist, he was a legend, a cultural force. When he walked into the studio, the air seemed to shift. He didn't have to announce his presence. Everyone just knew. Diddy greeted him like an old friend, the kind of easy camaraderie that comes from years of shared success and mutual understanding. Meanwhile, I was frozen, staring at a man whose music had shaped entire generations. JayZ barely said a word at first, but when he did, it carried weight. "This track," he said, nodding toward the speaker, "needs to breathe. Pull back the vocals in the hook." His tone was calm, measured, and yet it silenced the entire room. Everyone, including Diddy, nodded like it was gospel. Watching them interact was like seeing two kings strategize over their empires. At first, I was content with my small role, fetching coffee, managing schedules, taking notes. It was menial, sure, but I told myself it was a foot in the door. Besides, I got to witness greatness up close. What aspiring artist wouldn't kill for that? And when Diddy told me, "Stick with me and you'll learn more than any school could teach you," I believed him. His charisma was undeniable, his words filled with the kind of confidence that made you want to follow him anywhere. But then came the exclusivity. It started with small things. Invites to private dinners and events that weren't part of any official schedule. "This is where the real magic happens," Diddy said one evening as he handed me an invitation embossed with gold lettering. The event was held in one of his private lounges, far from the buzz of the studio. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with expensive cologne and unspoken rules. Next, he leveled a warning at me. If this escapes you, expect expensive cologne and unspoken rules. At first, it seemed harmless. People laughed and toasted glasses of champagne, sharing stories about their rise to fame. Diddy commanded the room as always, and even JayZs showed up for a brief moment, exchanging quiet words with Diddy before disappearing just as quickly. But there was something else beneath the surface, a tension I couldn't quite place. The way people's eyes darted around the room, the way laughter sometimes felt forced. It was subtle but impossible to ignore. Then came the first NDA. I was pulled aside by one of Diddy's assistants, who handed me a thick envelope. "You'll need to sign this," she said, her tone brisk but polite. "Standard procedure." I flipped through the pages, the legal jargon blurring together. "What's this for?" I asked, my voice hesitant. "It's just to make sure everyone's on the same page," she replied, smiling tightly. "You'll be exposed to sensitive information while working here, and discretion is key." It felt wrong to sign something I didn't fully understand, but what choice did I have? This was Diddy, one of the most powerful men in the industry. Pushing back felt like career suicide. So I signed. And just like that, I realized I was no longer just an aspiring artist. I was part of something much bigger, something I didn't yet understand. The secrecy didn't stop there. Instructions became more cryptic. "Don't ask questions, just follow orders," was a phrase I started hearing more and more, especially during the exclusive events. I'd be asked to deliver envelopes to unnamed recipients, or I'd be told to stay late and make sure certain areas of the estate were secured. When I asked for details, I was met with the same rehearsed responses. "You'll understand in time, or it's better not to know." The unease crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across a room. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking things. After all, everyone around me seemed to move with such confidence, so assured in their roles. But then I started noticing the cracks. The way staff avoided making eye contact with Diddy when he entered a room, the tension in their shoulders, the way their conversations stopped abruptly whenever he was near. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper, more ingrained. One evening, I was tasked with setting up for another private event. As I arranged the seating and adjusted the lighting, I overheard a conversation between two of the staff. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders every few seconds. "Did you hear about last week?" one of them whispered. The other shook his head. "Don't talk about it. You know how he gets." Their words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to ask what they meant, but the fear in their eyes kept me silent. Instead, I focused on my task, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. Whew. As the days turned into weeks, the initial excitement began to wear off. The luxury, the access, the proximity to power, it all started to feel like a gilded cage. I still believed in the dream, still hoped this would lead to something better. But the red flags were piling up, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they were impossible to unsee. Everyone stopped to fix their lunch, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they were impossible to unsee. I was in too deep to walk away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something far darker than I'd ever imagined. And as I looked around at the carefully curated world of power and influence, I couldn't help but wonder, how much of this was real, and how much of it was just an illusion designed to keep people like me in line. The allure of power had pulled me in, but it was beginning to lose its shine, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew whatever I had gotten myself into, it was only the beginning. The door to the trailer opened, and a ragged young man with a thatched roof headed my way. Chapter 3. The parties. The first time I stepped into one of Diddy's infamous parties, it felt like I'd walked into a movie. The estate itself was stunning. A sprawling mansion lit up against the night sky, with fountains that sparkled like something out of a dream. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, each one shinier and more expensive than the last. Music thumped in the background, vibrating through the air as I followed the flow of people inside. I'd been personally invited. It wasn't a casual invitation either. One of Diddy's assistants had called me that morning, making it clear that this was an opportunity I shouldn't miss. "He wants you there," she'd said. "Be ready by 8, dress sharp." Walking into that party, I couldn't help but feel proud. I'd earned my place here, hadn't I? All those years of struggle had led me to this moment, but as much as I wanted to believe that, something about the atmosphere was off. It wasn't the glitz or the glamour, those were expected. It was the people. They moved with an odd sort of precision, like every gesture, every word was calculated. Even the laughter seemed rehearsed, too loud and too perfect. The first half hour was overwhelming. The sheer number of famous faces was enough to make my head spin. Actors, artists, producers, they were all there, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries like they weren't some of the most powerful people on the planet. I even spotted JayZ in the corner of the room, deep in conversation with a small group. His presence was magnetic. The way he carried himself, calm and commanding, made it clear why he was a legend. People didn't just listen to him. They absorbed every word. It wasn't long before Diddy himself made his grand entrance. He didn't walk into a room so much as take control of it. Dressed in a sharp suit, his smile wide and confident, he moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands and slapping backs like he owned the place, which of course he did. When he spotted me, he waved me over. "Look at you," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Welcome to the big leagues." For a moment, I felt like I'd belonged. Diddy introduced me to a few people, talking me up like I was the next big thing. It was surreal. I couldn't stop smiling, soaking up the attention and trying to ignore the little voice in my head that kept telling me this was too good to be true. Then came the performance. It wasn't a surprise. Diddy had mentioned earlier that he might ask me to showcase my talent. Still, standing there in front of a room full of industry heavyweights, I felt my stomach twist into knots. I picked up the mic, took a deep breath, and gave it everything I had. The applause was polite but distant, and while Diddy smiled and nodded in approval, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just another part of the night's entertainment. As the evening wore on, the mood of the party began to shift. The energy became darker, heavier. At first, it was subtle. Whispers between guests, security guards moving more deliberately, doors to certain rooms quietly closing. I noticed younger attendees scattered throughout the crowd, their eyes darting nervously around the room. They didn't mingle or laugh like the others. Instead, they stayed close to the walls, their expressions tense and uncertain. It was hard to pinpoint when the unease started creeping in, but one moment stands out. I was standing near the bar when I saw a man mid-30s, well-dressed, being escorted out by 2 security guards. He wasn't just leaving, he was being removed. His voice rose in protest, but it was cut short by a sharp look from Diddy. The man's face fell, and he went silent, allowing himself to be led away without another word. "Don't worry about that," someone beside me said, their voice low. I turned to see one of Diddy's assistants, her expression unreadable. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was clear that whatever had just happened was serious, and the way Diddy had handled it, calm, calculated, and utterly cold, left me shaken. Later, as the party continued, I found myself wandering through the estate. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just trying to clear my head. The further I went from the main gathering, the quieter it became. The laughter and music faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. I passed a hallway where 2 guards were stationed, their posturing making it clear that I wasn't welcome to go any further. "So, private area," one of them said flatly, his eyes fixed straight ahead. I nodded and backed away, my curiosity tinged with unease. What was so private that it needed that level of security? The question lingered in my mind, even as I returned to the party and tried to blend back into the crowd. By the end of the night, I felt drained. What had started as an exciting opportunity had turned into something I couldn't quite explain. The glamour and prestige were real, but so were the shadows lurking just beneath the surface. As I left the estate and stepped into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking away from more than just a party. I was leaving with a sense that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to, and that somehow it was only the beginning. Chapter 4. JayZ's involvement. The further I got into Diddy's world, the more I realized how deep the roots of power and control truly ran. On the surface, it was all about music and influence, a carefully curated image of success, wealth, and charisma. But behind the scenes, something far more intricate was at play. It wasn't just about Diddy anymore. JayZ's presence loomed larger than I could have imagined, and his involvement sent chills down my spine. It started subtly, as most things in their world did. One night I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to. I had been tasked with delivering a stack of files to Diddy's private office, just another menial chore meant to keep me busy. When I reached the door, it was ajar, and their voices stopped me in my tracks. Diddy's tone was sharp, almost frantic, while JayZ's was the exact opposite, measured, calm, and unsettlingly deliberate. "You need to make sure it doesn't come back to us," Diddy snapped, his words clipped and tense. "It won't," JayZ replied, his voice low and confident. "But you're slipping, Sean. If you don't tighten up, all that noise you're making is going to draw the wrong kind of attention." "I've got it under control," Diddy shot back, but there was an edge to his voice that betrayed his nerves. "Just make sure the right people stay quiet." JayZ's response was chilling. "They always do." I froze, torn between wanting to leave and needing to hear more. Their conversation carried the weight of secrets too dangerous to confront, but it was clear they were discussing more than just business. The tension in the room was palpable, even from where I stood. Before I could linger any longer, I backed away, my heart pounding as I slipped out of earshot. Hey, we both knew that didn't help truly, but I was too afraid to wander away and talk about nothing. From that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that JayZ's role in everything wasn't just peripheral, it was central. Meeting JayZ in person for the first time was nothing like I'd imagined. Unlike Diddy, whose energy filled every room he entered, JayZ carried a quiet power. He didn't need to speak loudly or move dramatically to command attention. One glance, one word, and the entire room would fall silent. His presence was magnetic, but there was something else, something cold and calculating that made me feel like he saw through everything and everyone. I saw the horror in his eyes when he paused at the door to the music room. The introduction was brief, almost ceremonial. I had been brought into a meeting to take notes, a task that seemed simple but felt loaded with unspoken expectations. JayZ entered the room, his movements deliberate and smooth as if he had all the time in the world. When his eyes landed on me, it felt like being pinned under a microscope. "You're the new one," he said, his tone flat but not unkind. "Stick around long enough, and you'll learn what it takes to survive in this business." I managed to nod, my voice failing me. He turned his attention back to Diddy, and the meeting began. They spoke in codes, their words laced with layers of meaning that I couldn't fully decipher. At times, their conversation veered into discussions of handling issues and making sure everyone stays in line. It wasn't clear who or what they were referring to, but the implications left my stomach in knots. Over time, I began to notice parallels between Diddy and JayZ, similarities in how they operated, but also stark differences in their approach. Diddy's control was overt, almost performative. He thrived on intimidation, ensuring that everyone around him knew who held the power. JayZ, on the other hand, wielded his influence like a scalpel, quietly, precisely, and with devastating effect. One of the senior staff members, a man who had been working with Diddy for over a decade, let something slip one day. We were in the middle of a routine task when he leaned in and said, "JayZ's reach goes far beyond music. When things go south, he's the one who keeps the narrative clean. He makes sure the right people look the other way." I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't need to. The weight of his words settled heavily on me, adding another layer of unease to an already suffocating environment. Clyde's eyes drifted toward the door. My first direct interaction with JayZ beyond formal introductions came late one evening. I had been sent to deliver documents to his team, but instead of handing them off, I was told to bring them directly to him. He was sitting alone in a private lounge, a glass of something dark and expensive in his hand. He gestured for me to sit, and I obeyed, my nerves making it hard to think straight. "You've been around Sean long enough to see how this works," he said, his tone conversational but loaded with subtext. "This game isn't about talent or hard work. It's about knowing how to move, knowing who to trust, who to keep at arm's length, and who to silence when they talk too much." I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "You think you're here to make music? That's part of it, sure. But the real cost of being in this world, it's more than most people are willing to pay." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll find out." That conversation left me shaken. JayZ's words weren't just advice, they were a warning. The deeper I got into their world, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about music. It was about control, manipulation, and a power structure designed to protect those at the top at any cost. By this point, my unease had grown into outright suspicion. It wasn't just the whispers, the NDAs, or the cryptic advice. It was the way everything seemed interconnected. Diddy's operations, JayZ's influence, and the unspoken rules that governed their world. The more I observed, the more I realized that their partnership wasn't just about business. It was about maintaining a system that thrived on secrecy and exploitation. I didn't have all the pieces yet, but I was beginning to see the shape of something much larger and far darker than I'd ever imagined. Chapter 5. The Exploitation. The day started like any other, with a list of tasks that felt increasingly demeaning. Fetch coffee, confirm appointments, deliver packages to locations that were always classified. I'd stopped asking questions about why things needed to be done a certain way or where, exactly, I was delivering things. The less I knew, the easier it was to get through the day, or so I thought. That afternoon, I was handed a sleek, black envelope and told to take it to one of Diddy's private events. These gatherings were always shrouded in secrecy, with strict instructions not to linger or interact with anyone unless explicitly told to. I'd been to a few before, and while they were glamorous on the surface, something about them always felt off. The air was thick with tension, as though everyone present knew they were part of something larger, something that couldn't be spoken of aloud. When I arrived, the mansion looked the same as always, impossibly extravagant, with towering gates and an endless driveway. Security was tighter than usual, though, with guards patting down everyone who entered, and an almost palpable nervousness in their movements. I was waved through without much ceremony, my envelope clutched tightly in my hand. Inside, the atmosphere was even stranger. The usual chatter and laughter were subdued, replaced by hushed tones and furtive glances. I made my way to the designated room, hoping to drop off the envelope quickly and leave. But as I approached, I heard voices that stopped me in my tracks. "You sure this is the right group for tonight?" a man asked, his tone low but urgent. "These are the new ones," another voice replied. "Fresh talent. VIPs are gonna love them." The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what they meant, but the way they were spoken, calculated, detached, made my stomach turn. I hesitated, debating whether to open the door or turn around and leave. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, pushed me forward. The room wasn't what I expected. It was lavishly decorated with plush furniture and soft lighting that seemed designed to put people at ease. But the people inside weren't at ease at all. They were young, too young. Some sat on couches, their faces blank and unseeing, while others stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot like they wanted to disappear. Most were dressed in outfits that seemed chosen for them, their hair and makeup done to perfection. They looked like dolls on display. I froze in the doorway, unsure of what to do. My presence seemed to go unnoticed at first, but then one of the girls turned and looked directly at me. She couldn't have been older than 16. Her eyes were wide with terror, her lips trembling as though she wanted to speak but couldn't. Before I could react, a man stepped between us, blocking my view. "Delivery?" he asked, his tone curt. I nodded. My voice caught in my throat as I handed him the envelope. He took it without another word and disappeared deeper into the room. I stayed where I was, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from what was happening around me. "All right, let's get them ready," another voice said, snapping me out of my daze. Two women entered the room, their expressions cold and efficient as they began directing the young attendees. "You stand up straight, smile, look like you want to be here," one of them barked at a girl who flinched at her tone. Another was handed a tray of drinks and told to make yourself useful. The entire scene felt surreal, like I was watching a play where everyone knew their role except me. I was hoping the waitress would retire on my behalf. Then I heard it, the phrase that would haunt me long after I left that room. "Special deliveries are ready for the VIPs." The words were spoken casually, as though they were talking about catering or decorations, but I knew, deep down, that they weren't. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but the implication was clear. These young people weren't here by choice. They were here for someone else's entertainment, their value reduced to whatever purpose they could serve. I wanted to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't stop staring at the young girl who had looked at me earlier. She was being led toward a side door by a security guard, her steps hesitant and her head bowed. Just before she disappeared, she glanced over her shoulder and met my gaze again. The look in her eyes, pleading, resigned, and utterly devoid of hope, seared itself into my memory. I didn't know what to do. What could I do? I was just an assistant, and nobody in a world where power ruled and questions weren't allowed. I felt a crushing sense of helplessness as I stood there, watching her vanish through the door. For a brief moment, I considered following, but the cold, unyielding gaze of the guards reminded me of my place. I'd seen what happened to people who crossed the line in this world, and I wasn't ready to risk everything. Not yet. On my way out, I overheard more snippets of conversation that only deepened my unease. End of text. "Keep it quiet this time. Last thing we need is another incident," one man muttered. "Don't worry, everything's under control. They won't remember a thing," another replied. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. My mind raced, replaying everything I'd just seen and heard. The glamorous facade I'd been so captivated by was crumbling, revealing the darkness lurking beneath. I'd wanted to believe that this world was my ticket to success, but now I wasn't so sure. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving more than just the mansion behind. I was leaving pieces of myself, my naivety, my hope, and maybe even my humanity. I'd stepped into a world where ambition wasn't just a driving force, it was a weapon, used to exploit and destroy. And the deeper I went, the harder it became to look away. But I couldn't forget her, the young girl with the terrified eyes. She was still there, trapped in a nightmare I'd barely begun to understand. And as much as I wanted to believe I could walk away from it all, I knew I couldn't. Not without answers. Not without doing something. Chapter 6. The System Unveiled. I thought I'd seen it all. After months of working in Diddy's orbit and catching glimpses of JayZ's shadowed involvement, I was certain nothing could surprise me anymore. But when the truth finally hit me, it was like a tidal wave, pulling me under and leaving me gasping for air. What I learned about their world didn't just shatter my illusions. It made me question everything I thought I knew about power, influence, and humanity. It started with a mistake. One of the junior staffers, a young guy who looked like he'd been chewed up and spit out by the industry more times than he cared to admit, had too much to drink at one of the exclusive after parties. I had seen him before, always in the background, moving quietly, head down, like he was trying to disappear. But that night, he approached me, his steps unsteady, his eyes bloodshot. "They're not what they seem," he mumbled, his voice slurring but heavy with conviction. "None of this is..." I tried to brush him off. I'd heard enough cryptic warnings by now to know they usually led nowhere, but something about his desperation stopped me. Before I could say anything, he grabbed my arm and pulled me into a quiet corner. "Don't tell her. You want to know what's really going on? Meet me tomorrow, the parking lot, midnight." He shoved a slip of paper into my hand, then stumbled away before I could respond. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't go. I didn't need more trouble. I was already in too deep, surrounded by NDAs and vague threats that felt like they could crush me if I stepped out of line. But as the hours ticked by, curiosity gnawed at me. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was standing in the parking lot, my nerves on edge. The staffer arrived late, his face pale and drawn, like he hadn't slept in days. He glanced around nervously before handing me a flash drive. "Everything you need to know is on here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Files, recordings, names, just be careful. They'll kill to keep this quiet." I wanted to ask him more, but he was already walking away, his head low and shoulders hunched. I held the drive in my hand, its weight far heavier than its size, and wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Back in my apartment, I plugged the drive into my laptop, my hands shaking. What I found left me frozen. The files were a tangled web of spreadsheets, emails, and video footage, all pointing to a system that stretched far beyond anything I'd imagined. The parties, the mentorship programs, the private events, they weren't just celebrations of success or opportunities to network. They were fronts, carefully constructed to lure in victims and shield the predators behind them. The recordings showed young men and women, some barely out of their teens, being coerced into compromising situations. The spreadsheets detailed transactions, names, dates, amounts paid, and the emails. The emails were the worst. They were cold, clinical exchanges between powerful figures, discussing inventory and shipments like they were trading goods, not human lives. One name came up over and over: JayZ. His involvement was subtle, almost hidden, but undeniable. While Diddy orchestrated the day-to-day operations, JayZ's fingerprints were on the system's design. He was the architect, the one who built the network and ensured its survival. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about personal indulgence or gratification. It was about control of people, of industries, of narratives. The files hinted at international connections, deals brokered with politicians, business magnates, and even law enforcement officials. Victims were trafficked across borders, their identities erased, their stories buried under layers of bureaucracy and corruption. The system was airtight, protected by wealth, influence, and a ruthless willingness to destroy anyone who threatened it. One video stood out among the rest. It showed a girl, no older than 16, being escorted into a private jet. Her face was blank, her movements robotic, as if she'd already given up fighting. In the background, I heard a voice I recognized all too well, Diddy's. He was laughing, his tone casual, as he discussed keeping things quiet with someone off camo. My stomach churned. I slammed the laptop shut, unable to watch anymore. The room spun around me as the weight of what I'd discovered pressed down on my chest. This wasn't just exploitation. It was a machine, a monstrous entity designed to strip people of their humanity and turn them into commodities. Panic set in as I realized what I'd stumbled into. I wasn't just another employee or associate anymore. I was a liability, someone who knew too much, and in their world, liabilities didn't last long. I tried to tell myself I could walk away, pretend I hadn't seen anything, but the images and words burned into my mind wouldn't let me. I thought about the victims, the ones whose faces I'd seen on the drive, the ones who never had a chance to escape. If I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in their suffering. But speaking out felt impossible. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could I possibly do against a network this powerful? The system wasn't just protected by Diddy and JayZ. It was upheld by the very fabric of the industry, by people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. As the night dragged on, I sat in the dark, staring at the flash drive on my desk. My hands itched to destroy it, to erase the evidence and bury the truth. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. This was bigger than me, bigger than my fears. And if I didn't do something, no one else would. The realization left me cold. I wasn't just in danger. I was in a battle I wasn't prepared to fight. But there was no turning back now. The system had unveiled itself, and I couldn't unsee it. Chapter 7. The Fallout. I should have known it wouldn't end quietly. The moment I started considering what I'd seen and learned, the moment I even entertained the idea of speaking out, the pressure came crashing down. It started with subtle warnings. Anonymous texts would pop up on my phone. You're in over your head. Some secrets aren't worth keeping. Some aren't worth telling either. At first, I thought they were random threats, trolls trying to scare me, but they kept coming, always vague enough to make me doubt myself, but pointed enough to feel like someone was watching. The smallest thing attached to a rag was the text message from the July 2014 reading. Then came the emails. Most of them were short, one-liners that made my stomach twist. Stay in your lane. This isn't your fight. But one, sent from an untraceable account, shook me to my core. It listed details only someone close to me would know. My apartment number, the name of my favorite coffee shop, even the exact time I left the studio 2 nights ago. It ended with a single line: be smart. My paranoia skyrocketed. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every glance from a stranger made my skin crawl. And then, it got worse. One night, after a long session at a studio on the outskirts of the city, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It was simple, written in neat, blocky handwriting. You've seen too much. Keep your mouth shut. My blood ran cold. Whoever they were, they wanted me to know that they could find me anytime, anywhere. That same night, I got a call from someone I never expected to hear from again. One of Diddy's enforcers. I'd seen him before, always lurking on the edges of those exclusive events, never saying much but always keeping a watchful eye. His voice on the phone was calm, almost casual, but the weight of his words hit like a hammer. You're making things complicated, he said, as if we were discussing a minor inconvenience. That's not good for you, not good for anyone. Just move on. Forget what you think you know. I couldn't even respond before he hung up. I sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with possibilities. What if they were right? What if speaking out wasn't worth the risk? What if I was putting myself in danger for nothing? After a long pause, I said nothing and sat in my car, exasperation turning to confusion. But I couldn't ignore my conscience. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the people who couldn't speak for themselves, the ones who had been silenced, coerced, or destroyed by this system. Their stories deserved to be told, even if it came at a cost. I did in one of the few people I still trusted, a friend from my early days in the industry, someone who'd seen enough to understand the stakes. When I told them everything, their reaction was immediate. "You need to leave," they said, their voice trembling with urgency. "This isn't just about you anymore. Diddy, JayZ, they don't play by the same rules as everyone else. Their reach it's beyond what you think." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew they were right. These men weren't just powerful, they were untouchable. Their influence woven into every corner of the industry and beyond. Going up against them felt like standing in front of a freight train, hoping it would stop out of sheer decency. Still, I wrestled with the idea. Could I really walk away, knowing what I knew? Could I live with myself if I stayed silent, complicit in their crimes? That's when I saw him again, JayZ. It wasn't planned. We crossed paths at an industry event, one of those polished, high-profile gatherings where everyone wore their masks of professionalism and charm. He was surrounded by his usual entourage, but when his eyes met mine, he motioned for me to step aside. The crowd parted like water, and for a moment, it was just the two of us. "You look tired," he said, his tone neutral, but his gaze piercing. "Heavy lies the head, huh?" I didn't know how to respond. His presence was commanding, almost suffocating, and every word he spoke seemed to carry layers of meaning I couldn't fully grasp. "You're playing a dangerous game," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think you can handle it? You think you know what you're up against?" I opened my mouth to speak, but he cut me off with a slight shake of his head. "There's a price for everything," he said, his expression unreadable. "Make sure you're ready to pay it." And just like that, he was gone, swallowed up by the crowd. I stood there, frozen, his words replaying in my mind. A price for everything. Was it a warning, a threat, or something else entirely? That encounter left me shaken. For all his calm and control, there was something chilling about the way he spoke, as if he wasn't just talking about me, but about himself too. It made me wonder how many people had paid the price for crossing him, and how many more would suffer if I didn't speak out. By the time I left the event, I felt like a shadow of myself. The threats, the warnings, the cryptic encounter with JayZ, it was all too much. But as I sat in my car, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I realized something. Fear was their weapon. It was how they controlled people, how they kept their secrets buried and their empire intact. And if I let that fear consume me, they'd win. They always won. But not this time. Not if I could help it. Chapter 8. The Revelation. When I finally decided to come forward, it wasn't out of courage or bravery. It was desperation. The kind that gnaws at you until you can't sleep, until you can't think about anything else. The weight of what I'd seen and experienced working under Diddy and later witnessing JayZ's shadowy involvement had become unbearable. Keeping it inside felt like suffocating, and I knew if I didn't say something, I'd never forgive myself. But speaking out wasn't as simple as telling my story. These were two of the most powerful men in the industry, surrounded by teams of lawyers, PR experts, and enforcers whose entire purpose was to silence people like me. If I was going to expose them, I needed proof. Luckily, I'd spent months gathering it, not just for myself, but for the others whose voices were being drowned out. I started by leaking what I had to a journalist, a trusted source known for uncovering corruption. The evidence was damning. Photos, recordings, documents, all pointing to a network of exploitation, coercion, and trafficking that went far beyond the music industry. I kept my identity hidden, using encrypted emails and burner accounts, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they traced it back to me. The fallout was immediate. Articles began to surface, first on niche investigative sites and then in mainstream outlets. Headlines screamed allegations of abuse, trafficking, and cover-ups. The stories weren't just about Diddy and JayZ. They revealed a system designed to protect powerful men at the expense of countless victims. Predictably, their teams went into damage control mode. Statements were released, full of denials. I was painted as a disgruntled former employee, someone with an axe to grind or a desperate need for attention. They claimed the evidence was fabricated, that the leaks were part of a coordinated effort to take them down. The hardest part was seeing people believe them. Fans and industry insiders rushed to their defense, accusing the media of trying to tear down black icons or calling me a liar without even knowing who I was. It made me question whether I'd made the right choice. Was anyone really going to listen? But then, something shifted. Other survivors began to come forward. Their stories were eerily similar to mine, tales of manipulation, coercion, and abuse, all orchestrated under the guise of mentorship or opportunity. Some spoke of the exclusive parties where boundaries were crossed and lives were shattered. Others described the NDAs, the threats, the crushing fear that kept them silent for years. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. The stories kept coming, and the public outrage grew. Some of their closest allies began to distance themselves, issuing statements condemning the alleged actions without naming names. It was clear the tide was turning, but the fight was far from over. Even as more survivors spoke out, the system pushed back. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted under mysterious circumstances. Lawsuits were filed and quietly settled out of court. It became clear that this wasn't just about two men. It was about an entire machine, built to protect them. I knew the risks when I came forward. I knew they'd come after me, that I'd never truly be safe, and I was right. Even now, I move from place to place, watching my back, waiting for the day when someone decides I've said too much. But I also know that staying silent was never an option. My story may not be enough to bring them down, but it's a start. It's a crack in the armor of a system that's thrived on fear and silence for far too long. As I sit here writing this, I think about the others who haven't come forward yet, the ones who are still too afraid, who've been silenced or erased. I think about the survivors who didn't make it, whose stories will never be told. And I think about the people who protected Diddy and JayZ, the ones who knew and did nothing, who allowed this cycle of abuse to continue because it benefited them. Justice feels like an impossible dream some days. The machine is too big, too entrenched, too well protected. But I've learned something in this fight. Power doesn't crumble overnight. It chips away, piece by piece, until one day, the foundation collapses. As the mountain washed away, the ground collapses with it, and with it, the rock. Maybe that day will come in my lifetime. Maybe it won't. But I know this. By telling my story, I've planted a seed. And with every voice that joins mine, that seed grows into something stronger, something they can't ignore or silence. The truth is out there now. It's messy and incomplete, but it's out there, and no matter how hard they try, they can't put it back in the box. End of section 8. As I finished this, I can't help but wonder what the world will look like in 10 years or 20. Will we still be fighting the same battles, or will things finally start to change? I don't know. But I do know this: silence isn't an option. Not for me. Not for anyone. WWEF, from families and friends. the story isn't over. It's just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on the right side of it.